Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be back.
Today we're going to be looking at something a little different, something you might not expect.
Yeah. The mistakes.
The blunders.
Some of the biggest names in science.
That you might be thinking, why focus on the negatives?
Right.
But that's what's so interesting.
Exactly. We're going to be looking at how these missteps actually helped shape our understanding of the world.
In a way, you could say they were brilliant blunders.
Brilliant blunders. I like that.
It's actually the name of a book by astrophysicist Mario Livio.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's going to be our guide for this deep dive.
Okay, so what scientists are we talking about here?
Oh, we've got a great lineup. Charles Darwin, Lord Kelvin, Linus Pauling, Fred Hoyle,
And
even Albert Einstein.
no way. These are some of the biggest names in science.
Exactly. These are the giants, the folks whose names are practically synonymous with genius.
And that's what makes their blunders so fascinating.
It shows that even the most brilliant minds are human. They make mistakes, they have biases, and sometimes they just plain get things wrong.
And Livio digs into how those errors often lead to major breakthroughs.
He kicks things off with a great story about chess grandmaster Bobby Fischer.
Oh, yeah, the guy who went on that epic winning streak and became world champion in 1972.
Right during that championship match, Fischer made a move so baffling, so out of character, that people called it chess blindness.
Chess blindness.
Yeah, he just overlooked something obvious, something a player of his caliber should have seen.
It's like having a blind spot.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what causes these mental blind spots, these moments where even the sharpest minds miss the mark.
And could something like that happen in science?
It happens all the time.
Really?
And that's where the idea of brilliant blunders comes in.
Okay, so these aren't just any old mistakes.
No, these are mistakes that shake things up, force people to rethink their assumptions, and often lead to unexpected discoveries.
I'm intrigued. Let's get into some examples.
Okay, so our first brilliant blunder comes from Charles Darwin, the father of the theory of evolution.
I think most people have at least a basic understanding of evolution, right? Survival of the fittest.
Yeah, the draft neck thing. But there's more to it than that. Darwin outlined 4 key pillars.
Okay, hit me with them.
We've got evolution itself, gradualism, common descent, and of course, natural selection.
And just to be clear, the idea that species change over time wasn't brand new, but Darwin, along with Alfred Russel Wallace, really nailed down the mechanism natural selection.
Right, and natural selection is all about the interplay of random variation and environmental pressures.
So nature is constantly experimenting through mutations, and environmental pressures act like a filter.
Exactly, favoring those variations that boost survival and reproduction.
Livio gives some really cool examples of this in action, like that fish, the Ocellaris clownfish.
Nemo.
Yeah, Finding Nemo, they live in those anemones that have stinging tentacles.
Right, most fish avoid them, but clownfish have adapted to live among them. They get protection from predators.
And in return, they protect the anemones from other fish that might want to eat them.
It's a win-win situation, totally shaped by natural selection.
And then there's the case of the peppered moth in England.
Oh yeah, during the Industrial Revolution, the trees got darker because of all the pollution.
Right, so the darker moths suddenly had better camouflage.
Exactly. It was a classic example of natural selection in action. The environment changed, and what was once advantageous became a liability.
So natural selection drives these amazing adaptations, but even Darwin made a major blunder.
He got stuck on this idea called the blending theory of inheritance.
Blending theory.
Yeah, it's like mixing paint colors. Red and white make pink.
Okay, but what's wrong with that?
The problem is if traits blended like that, beneficial variations would just get diluted over time.
I guess that makes sense. So how did Darwin try to reconcile this with natural selection?
What gets even more interesting, he almost stumbled onto the answer himself.
Really?
He was doing all these experiments with snapdragons crossing different varieties.
Okay.
And he started noticing patterns in how traits showed up in the offspring. He even recorded a ratio of about 3-to-1 for certain traits.
Wait a minute, that's the classic Mendelian ratio.
Exactly. But he didn't quite grasp the significance of what he was seeing.
It was so close.
I know, it's like having the answer right in front of you but not recognizing it.
So what happened?
Instead of embracing the idea of discrete units of inheritance, what we now call genes, Darwin clung to this idea called pangenesis.
Pangenesis?
Yeah. It involved these tiny particles called gymules that supposedly carried information from all parts of the body to the offspring.
Sounds complicated.
It was, and it was ultimately wrong. But the point is, Darwin's brilliant idea of natural selection was held back by his flawed understanding of inheritance.
So his own success with natural selection might have blinded him to a better explanation for heredity.
It happens, and it shows how even groundbreaking theories can be limited by the knowledge of the time.
It also emphasizes the importance of constantly challenging assumptions, even your own.
And, in the end, Darwin's blunder paved the way for the fusion of Mendelian genetics and evolutionary theory, leading to an even richer understanding of how life evolves.
Okay, so we've talked about Darwin and his brilliant blunder, but our next deep dive takes us from biology to physics, where we meet Lord Kelvin, a scientific heavyweight, who made a major miscalculation about the age of the Earth.
And this one really highlights how our assumptions can shape our understanding of the world, even when we're dealing with hard science like physics.
Stay tuned, because we're about to dig into the story of Lord Kelvin's brilliant blunder, and trust me, it's a good one. Okay, so we're talking about Lord Kelvin. This titan of physics laid the first transatlantic telegraph cable. The guy was brilliant.
Oh yeah, a true pioneer in applying physics to understand the natural world.
But he also had this very public, very wrong idea about how old the Earth is.
And you have to remember, back in the 19th century, figuring out the age of the Earth was a big deal.
Before that, people were relying on what the Bible said.
Right, like Archbishop Usher's famous calculation that creation happened in 4004 BC.
But Kelvin wanted to use science to answer this question, specifically physics.
Exactly. He was a master of thermodynamics.
Yeah.
The study of heat and energy.
So how did he apply that to the Earth's age?
Well, he focused on heat conduction and cooling, trying to figure out how long it would have taken for the Earth to cool from a molten state to its current temperature.
So he was treating the Earth like a giant cooling pie.
Kind of, yeah. And based on his calculations, he estimated the Earth to be somewhere between 20 and 40 million years old.
That's way younger than what we know today.
It is, and at the time, it caused a huge controversy.
Why?
Because his estimate clashed with what geologists and biologists were finding.
They were seeing evidence for processes that would have taken much longer than that, right?
Exactly. Geologists were finding rock formations and fossils that pointed to a much older Earth.
And biologists, especially those inspired by Darwin's work, were arguing that evolution would have needed way more time to create the diversity of life we see. It was like a scientific showdown, physics versus geology and biology.
And Kelvin was pretty sure of his calculations. He was a respected scientist, and his work in thermodynamics had been really successful.
But even back then, people were pointing out flaws in his logic.
Yeah, Thomas Huxley, a big supporter of Darwin, argued that Kelvin's calculations were based on a simplified view of the Earth.
A simplified view, how?
Kelvin assumed the Earth was solid and uniform.
Okay.
But Huxley argued that if the Earth's interior was more complex, maybe partially molten with internal convection currents, that would change the cooling rate significantly.
So it wasn't Kelvin's math that was wrong. It was the assumptions he was making about the Earth.
Exactly. Like trying to bake a cake without knowing you need an oven.
You're going to have a bad time.
And the missing ingredient in Kelvin's case was radioactivity.
Ah, because radioactivity hadn't been discovered yet.
Right, this is the late 19th century, and nobody knew about this internal heat source within the Earth.
So Kelvin had no way of knowing that radioactive decay was constantly releasing heat and keeping the Earth warmer for much longer.
Exactly, and that discovery really threw a wrench into his calculation.
So once radioactivity was on the scene, Kelvin's age estimates for the Earth were basically toast?
Well, it wasn't that simple. Even after the discovery of radioactivity, Kelvin remained skeptical for a while.
Really? Why?
He'd built his reputation on those calculations, and it's hard to let go of an idea you've been championing for so long.
It's like that saying, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks.
Exactly. And Kelvin, despite his brilliance, wasn't always the most flexible thinker. He even tried to explain away radioactivity by suggesting that radium, the element Marie Curie was studying, might be drawing energy from some external source.
So he was trying to fit this new discovery into his existing framework rather than letting it reshape his understanding.
And that's a common theme we see with brilliant blunders. Sometimes our past successes can blind us to new possibilities.
But eventually, even Kelvin had to accept the evidence radioactivity did exist. It provided an internal heat source for the Earth, and his age estimates were way off.
And this whole debate wasn't just about getting the age of the Earth right. It was about the nature of scientific inquiry itself.
How so?
Kelvin's blunder highlighted the importance of questioning assumptions, remaining open to new evidence, and understanding that even the brightest minds can get things wrong.
It also showed how different fields of science can work together to get closer to the truth.
Yeah, in this case, geology and biology provided crucial clues that physics on its own couldn't explain.
It's a great example of how science is a collaborative effort constantly evolving and building upon itself.
And sometimes it takes a brilliant blunder to shake things up and push us in the right direction.
Speaking of shaking things up, our next brilliant blunder takes us into the race to uncover the structure of DNA, that double helix we all know and love.
And this time we meet Linus Pauling, a two-time Nobel Prize winner, who almost beat Watson and Crick to the finish line.
Oh, this is getting good. Tell me more. So Pauling, this two-time Nobel Prize winner, he was in the race to figure out the structure of DNA, but he stumbled.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, actually.
Yeah.
Well, Pauling was so focused on proteins, he thought they held the key to life. He kind of underestimated DNA.
It's like looking for your keys in the wrong place.
Exactly. And to make things worse, he had this misconception about phosphorus.
Phosphorus.
Yeah, he thought phosphorus atoms could make 5 bonds, when in these kinds of molecules, they can only form 4.
So even a little detail like that can throw off a whole model.
Oh, absolutely. And on top of that, he was really into inductive reasoning.
Inductive reasoning.
Yeah, basically using past successes to predict future ones.
Okay.
He'd nailed a lot of molecular structures that way. But with DNA, it led him astray.
So his own track record became a kind of a blind spot.
You could say that. And here's the kicker. He didn't have the sharpest images of DNA to work with.
Ah, the X-ray pictures.
The ones he had were blurry compared to what Watson and Crick were using over in England.
Talk about bad luck.
Yeah, and it gets worse.
What could be worse than blurry pictures?
Well, he ended up proposing a triple helix model for DNA.
A triple helix?
Yeah, with the backbone on the inside and the bases sticking out.
Wait, doesn't that go against basic chemistry?
It does. It just didn't make sense chemically.
So he was working with fuzzy pictures and picturing the whole thing backwards?
Pretty much. And meanwhile, Watson and Crick are in England putting together their model.
And they had Rosalind Franklin's clear X-ray images, right?
Right. And they also had Erwin Chargaff's base pairing rules.
Remind me what those were again?
Chargaff had found that in any DNA sample, the amount of adenine always matches thymine and guanine always matches cytosine.
So A with T and G with C.
Exactly. It was a huge clue about how the bases were pairing up inside the molecule.
It's like finding the matching puzzle pieces.
And while Watson and Crick were putting those pieces together, Pauling went and published his triple helix model.
Wait, so he published an incorrect model?
He did.
But didn't that help Watson and Crick?
It did. Their lab director, Lawrence Bragg, had been kind of hesitant about their DNA work.
I see.
But when Pauling, this big shot Nobel laureate, published a flawed model, it was a wake-up call for Bragg.
So Pauling's blunder was their lucky break.
In a way, yeah, lit a fire under Bragg. He realized the race was on, and he told Watson and Crick to go full speed ahead.
So within weeks, they figured out the double helix.
They did, and ironically, Pauling's mistake motivated him to go to England to see the data Watson and Crick were using.
Oh, no.
But by the time he got there, they'd already won the race.
What a story. It shows how science can be a mix of brilliance, competition, and a little bit of luck.
Absolutely. And it also highlights how setbacks can be just as important as successes.
Because Pauling's blunder indirectly paved the way for one of the biggest discoveries in biology.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can learn just as much from our mistakes as we can from our triumphs.
Okay, so we've talked about Darwin, Kelvin, and Pauling, each of them making these significant blunders that ultimately advanced our understanding of evolution, the age of the Earth, and the structure of DNA.
And what's fascinating is that these weren't just isolated incidents. They represent a pattern we see throughout the history of science.
A pattern of brilliant minds making mistakes that ultimately lead to progress.
Exactly. And it really speaks to the nature of scientific inquiry itself.
It's not about being right all the time. It's about being curious, asking questions, testing assumptions, and being open to new ideas, even if they challenge our existing beliefs.
And sometimes it takes a brilliant blunder to shake things up and push us in the right direction.
So to all the aspiring scientists out there, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Embrace the unexpected detours, and remember that even the most brilliant minds can get things wrong.
Because in those missteps, those blunders, we often find the seeds of new understanding and groundbreaking discoveries.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of brilliant blunders. We'll see you next time for more explorations into the fascinating world of science.